Core of the Bible podcast number 14, Forgiveness, Reconciliation, and Practical Kindness. Welcome to the Core of the Bible podcast. My name is Steve, and I'll be your host as we explore the message of the Bible reduced to its simplest form. As you may know, it's my belief that the core of the Bible consists of 7 main principles of conduct surrounding the topics of kingdom, integrity, vigilance, holiness, trust, forgiveness, and compassion. And in this episode, we're going to be exploring the topic of forgiveness, some practical ways to demonstrate forgiveness, and the humility and kindness required when we concede to overlook the faults and aggression of others. Yeshua stated it this way in Matthew 6. He said, "For if you forgive men their wrongdoing, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive people, neither will your Father forgive your wrongdoing." Now, the overarching theme where this verse is tucked into the Sermon on the Mount is all about avoiding hypocrisy. Don't expect something of someone else, including God, if you're not willing to subject yourself to the same principles. If you expect to have God forgive you when you've wronged him, then you should be forgiving of those around you who have wronged you. But what does this type of forgiveness of other people look like? And how can it be enacted in practical ways? Well, Yeshua provides a couple of examples that include a brother who's offended us or an adversary who is also taking us to court. Let's look at it a little bit closer. Matthew 5, he says, "Therefore, if you're presenting your offering at the altar and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your offering there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother and then come and present your offering. Make friends quickly with your opponent at law while you're with him on the way, so that your opponent may not hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the officer, and you be thrown into prison. Truly, I say to you, you will not come out of there until you have paid up the last cent." Now, from this insight, Yeshua is teaching us that a primary aspect of forgiveness looks a lot like reconciliation. And by this standard, reconciliation with all others then must take place prior to worshiping God or seeking his forgiveness. And seeing how these two concepts are tied together so closely, we can therefore say forgiveness is the root and the foundation of all reconciliation. And this is a requirement if we are to be asking God for forgiveness. Now, additionally, there are 2 distinctive aspects of reconciliation that Yeshua brings to our attention here: reconciliation with a brother and reconciliation with an opponent. So let's take a closer look at both of these distinctions in more detail. Now, when we're talking about reconciliation with our brothers, most of us are likely familiar with another famous passage that Yeshua teaches about forgiveness, which involves a little bit of math, specifically 70 times 7. In Matthew 18, it's a very familiar passage. It says, "Then Peter came to Jesus and asked him, 'Lord, how often do I have to forgive a brother who wrongs me? 7 times?' Jesus answered him, 'I tell you, not just 7 times, but 70 times 7. Okay, now on a technical note, the phrase 70 times 7 could also mean 77 times. But I think it can be shown that whether 77 or 490 times, Yeshua is speaking in a figure of speech known as hyperbole. He's clearly exaggerating for the sake of emphasis, but it's an exaggerated emphasis worth making. The point is that no matter how many times someone offends us or does something wrong by us, we, as believers, as followers of Messiah, are obligated to forgive them. This is not an option for those claiming to be in the kingdom of God. And this is a hard teaching, which is why it's not practiced as much as it could or should be. Now, by contrast, if someone is not a believer, they're not likely to pay any attention to this concept, and they simply respond in kind when someone offends them. They will lash out, they'll hold a grudge, they'll seek retaliation, or basically do anything that does not require them to concede their position or their pride. Yet as believers, forgiveness of those who have offended us is a non-negotiable directive of Yeshua that must be adhered to. Now, for many years, when I had considered this passage, I had the idea that I would only have to forgive someone if they came to me and asked for forgiveness. And if they didn't, I wouldn't have to consider actively forgiving them. However, as I've grown, I've learned that we must take all of Yeshua's teaching into account if we're to be his followers. And in his teaching, there's no room for that kind of petty distinction. Our verse for study today rules out that option when it says, "Therefore, if you're presenting your offering at the altar and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your offering before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother and then come and present your offering." Now notice it says, when you remember that your brother has something against you, you would be obligated to drop what you're doing, even if you were in the process of offering a sacrifice at the temple. Well, to me, that conveys two things. Firstly, an obligation for reconciliation, because it needs to happen. And secondly, a sense of urgency in resolving conflict with all others at all times. Additionally, there's a third aspect that I touched on a few moments ago, where there's really no point in conducting acts of worship if we have unresolved conflict with others. From God's perspective, this is a kind of hypocritical schizophrenia that's not welcome in his kingdom. Time and time again, throughout his teachings, Yeshua and his followers emphasize how deeply religious hypocrisy is hated by God. Look at some of these examples. In Matthew 23, it says, "So you too outwardly appear righteous to men, but inwardly you're full of hypocrisy and lawlessness." And of course, that was Yeshua speaking with the religious leaders. In Luke 12, he says, he began saying to his disciples, first of all, "Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy." In 1 Peter 2, "So get rid of all evil behavior. Be done with all deceit, hypocrisy, jealousy, and all unkind speech." And in James 3, it says, "But the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, reasonable, full of mercy and good fruits, unwavering and without hypocrisy." So maybe you hadn't realized it before, but unresolved conflict in your life while claiming you're a child of God is hypocrisy. And God is not honored by that type of dichotomy. So now that I've stabbed you with that truth, allow me to twist the knife further by saying that this type of forgiveness is not only a requirement for our brothers and those close to us, but it's also a requirement for those who may be adversarial to us as well. So if you think it's hard to forgive a brother, how much more do you think we need to rely on God's strength to forgive an enemy? So while we might be able to comprehend how forgiveness of those closest to us is essential, we tend to bristle at the suggestion that those who can be considered our enemies or our adversaries are also to be the recipients of the same level of forgiveness from us. At the root of this reconciliation and forgiveness is a characteristic that perhaps we've not considered: respect. When we forgive and give people the benefit of any doubt, we're essentially respecting their perspective and their known or unknown motives, and we're responding with kindness rather than vindictiveness. From a practical standpoint, I freely admit this is one of the most difficult of all biblical principles to put into practice. Because if we actually do this with others, won't this open us up to be taken advantage of? Well, very possibly, yes. Some people will see that we're not offering any resistance to their position and they'll walk all over us. However, if we truly enact active kindness and not just mute submission, what's more likely to happen is something that we're taught from the Torah or instruction of God when we're kind to our enemies. Here's an example in Proverbs 25. It says, "If your enemies are hungry, give them food to eat. If they're thirsty, give them water to drink. You will heap burning coals of shame on their heads, and the Lord will reward you." And the Apostle Paul echoes this same sentiment when he writes in Romans 12. It says, "Never pay back evil with more evil. Do things in such a way that everyone can see you're honorable. Do all that you can to live in peace with everyone. Dear friends, never take revenge. Leave that to the righteous anger of God. For the scriptures say, 'I will take revenge. I will pay them back,' says the Lord. Instead, if your enemies are hungry, feed them. If they're thirsty, give them something to drink. And in doing this, you'll heap burning coals of shame on their heads. Don't let evil conquer you, but conquer evil by doing good." So we can see that by being actively good to those who are opposing us, we're going against those natural instincts to retaliate. It's an unexpected response, and it can cause them to recognize that they were acting foolishly. The metaphor of the burning coals being heaped on their head, it's a challenging one, but one that's meant to illustrate how recognized truth can be painful because it involves a recognition of one's own wrongdoing. And it typically takes something unusual to happen in order to shake us out of our destructive habits. When someone's nice to another person who's only been angry and mean with them, that's certainly one way to make that person sit up and take notice. And I'm sure almost everyone could share a story about someone who was sincerely nice to someone who was mean to them, and then that person was won over to friendship, or at least to stop the oppressive behavior. Now, there's no guarantee that will happen, but it does happen. And regardless of the outcome, it's still our biblical obligation to do so. Now, Yeshua makes another point about the necessity of reconciling with our adversaries. He says, make friends quickly with your opponent at law while you're with him on the way, so that your opponent may not hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the officer, and then you'll be thrown into prison. Truly I say to you, you will not come out of there until you have paid up the last cent. So reconciliation, even in legal matters, is a best practice that we're admonished by Yeshua to demonstrate. And we can recognize that when things have become legal battles, the communication, trust, and forgiveness have totally broken down. Yeshua instructs us to get ahead of this type of entanglement by agreeing with or making friends with our opponents. Now, the word here for making friends can be vague in English, but it implies a giving of oneself wholly. And to my way of thinking, if you're giving yourself wholly to your opponent, then you're essentially conceding the dispute, and you're choosing rather to bear the injustice. And this is a difficult position to maintain, but it is a precedent that Paul has set among believers who disagree. In 1 Corinthians 6, you may remember, it says, but instead one believer sues another right in front of unbelievers. Even to have such lawsuits with one another is a defeat for you. Why not just accept the injustice and leave it at that? Why not let yourselves be cheated? What? Let yourselves be cheated? I mean, Paul obviously is out of touch with our current societal standards of personal rights. Or is it rather that our current societal standards are maybe out of touch with the perfection of God's ideal? While Paul is admonishing this practice among believers, Yeshua seems to be implying that we should activate this same practice indiscriminately with everyone, even an adversary who would take you to court. We have to remember that in Yeshua's day, any type of legal court was essentially held at the whim of the judge. You could have an airtight case and still end up with having the ruling go against you. And then what would be the result? You'd be innocent, you'd have stated your case, but you'd still end up in prison. Yeshua's admonition for reconciliation or settling out of court is a safeguard and a protection for the early believers. If they practiced this, it would potentially protect them from an unjust verdict. There was no guarantee that a trial would be fair, and if they were to pursue their rights, they were putting themselves in jeopardy of imprisonment. It would go better for them if they settled or reconciled out of court. They would avoid a potential further injustice, and they would also be demonstrating a measure of love and forgiveness towards an adversary that could potentially change their heart as well. In Matthew 5, Yeshua says, but I say, love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. In that way, you'll be acting as true children of your Father in heaven. For he gives his sunlight to both the evil and the good, and he sends rain on the just and the unjust alike. And if you love only those who love you, what reward is there for that? Even corrupt tax collectors do that much. And if you're kind only to your friends, how are you different from anyone else? Even pagans do that. So we can see, as Yeshua also teaches here, by exhibiting kindness to our adversaries, we're providing them something they need, just like our Father provides sunlight and nourishing rain to all, because he knows these are basic needs, and especially so in an agrarian society. When we act the same way, we are responding as our Father would want us to respond. We are then allowing any legitimate vengeance or retaliation to come from him and him alone, since only he knows the hearts and true motives of all. Most of the time, we may also discover that no vengeance or retaliation is even necessary, simply because we didn't possess all of the facts at the time. And this includes adversaries and anyone we may know to be holding something against us. You see, God values reconciliation over proving our personal rightness in any situation. Forgiveness requires humility. Humility with our brothers and sisters, and humility with our adversaries. Our strength in this area can easily be perceived as foolishness and weakness by the rest of the world. But if that's the case, we're in good company. As Paul writes in 1 Corinthians, he says, "This foolish plan of God is wiser than the wisest of human plans, and God's weakness is stronger than the greatest of human strength. Instead, God chose things the world considers foolish in order to shame those who think they are wise, and he chose things that are powerless to shame those who are powerful. God chose things despised by the world, things counted as nothing at all, and used them to bring to nothing what the world considers important." You see, the relationships we have are mirrors of our heart actions towards others. Let me say that again. The relationships we have are mirrors of our heart actions towards others. People will typically be to us what we are to them, and vice versa. So when we take Yeshua's command to heart and break that cycle of mirroring behaviors, we have an opportunity to create new relationships, and these relationships can then bear fruit for God. Remember, God desires that we approach him without hypocrisy. God's always looking for our hearts to be pure and consistent in all ways with everyone. And this includes those close to us and those who would maintain an adversarial position towards us. And when we demonstrate humility and forgiveness with all others, we're taking a positive stance in a negative situation in which God has an opportunity to work and be glorified, because then we are truly behaving like his children and reaching out to the unreceptive just like he does. Well, once again, I hope I've been able to provide you some ideas and concepts to meditate on further. We need to keep in mind that if we're to truly overlook the faults of others, we need a measure of humility and understanding, because we just don't know everyone's motives. One of the clearest ways we can respect others is to forgive them when they have wronged us. So let's keep our focus on reconciliation with all others, in which God is glorified, because then we're mirroring his actions to an unreceptive world. So be sure to visit coreofthebible.org to join the conversation through comments, and to see daily blog posts on these topics, and to find free downloadable resources regarding the message of the Bible reduced to its simplest form. Do you have questions about today's topic, or comments or insights you'd like to share? Perhaps you found this podcast helpful or encouraging. If so, I would love to hear from you and include listener comments in future episodes. So feel free to email me at coreofthebible@gmail.com. That's coreofthebible@gmail.com. Thanks for your interest in listening today. As always, I hope to be invited back into your headphones in another episode to come. Take care.